Meantime, President Donald Trump's mass deportation effort getting some backlash from none other than Pope Francis. In response, Trump's border czar, Tom Homan, is telling the Pope,
Catholic Church, those are Mr. Homan's words, but I hear there is a man trying to build a wall to prevent immigrants from entering the United States. Meanwhile, his wife Melania is an immigrant. Brace up, folks, because Pope Francis absolutely destroyed the orange burger man himself this time. So it all started like this. Reporters from around the world have gathered for what they expect to be a routine press conference with Pope Francis. However, little do they know that this will become one of the most memorable moments in modern history. A masterclass in wit and humor, delivered by none other than His Holiness himself. Good morning, my dear friends. Pope Francis begins his voice warm yet commanding. Today I wish to speak on several matters of global importance, but first let us address something closer to home, or rather farther away, but still very much within our spiritual jurisdiction. He pauses, dramatically allowing the anticipation to build, then with a twinkle in his eye, he continues, I hear there's a man in America who wants to build a wall, a big, beautiful wall. He says it'll keep people out, but let me tell you something, God didn't create walls, he created bridges. If someone only thinks about building walls, well, that person cannot call themselves Christian. A ripple of laughter runs through the crowd. Some reporters exchange amused glances while others scribble furiously in their notebooks. The Pope smiles gently, knowing he has struck a chord, but wait, he adds, raising a finger for emphasis, it gets better. This same man talks about making deals, striking bargains and cutting costs, yet when it comes to compassion, empathy and kindness, suddenly these virtues are too expensive. History will judge such decisions, he declares, solemnly quoting his earlier remarks. The audience erupts into applause, clearly delighted by the Pope's sharp tongue. Now, moving on to another matter, Pope Francis says, adjusting his glasses, this gentleman also seems quite preoccupied with appearances, with size, with scale, with grandiosity. Everything must be bigger, better, more impressive. Even his handshake apparently needs to make headlines here. The Pope chuckles softly, almost conspiratorially. Let me share a story with you all. Once upon a time, Michelangelo was tasked with sculpting a statue of David. Imagine if today, instead of creating harmony and balance, Michelangelo had been asked to focus solely on the hands or the feet, or worse yet the ego. Oh, how tragic that would have been. The crowd bursts into laughter, again appreciating the subtle jab at Trump's infamous hand size comments. Inspired by this moment, the Pope leans forward slightly, his eyes twinkling mischievously, and speaking of size, he quips, if Michelangelo were designing statues for this particular leader, he'd need extra marble for the pedestal. Naturally, at this point, even the status journalist can't help but laugh aloud. It's clear that Pope Francis isn't just delivering a message, he's giving them a show. But enough about physical dimensions. The Pope continues, waving a dismissive hand. Let us turn our attention to something far more important. The soul, for it is here where true greatness lies, not in wealth, power, or fame, but in love, mercy and justice. Flash from religious leaders across the globe over its immigration policies. Pope Francis, in an open letter to America's Catholic bishops, saying, quote, I exhort all the faithful of the Catholic Church not to give in to narratives that discriminate against and cause unnecessary suffering to our migrant and refugee brothers and sisters. Meantime, a federal lawsuit is calling out the administration for allowing ICE agents to make arrests in houses of worship. His Tone shift slightly, becoming both serious and heartfelt. Recently I learned of plans to deport millions of migrants. Millions, can you imagine? These are not numbers, these are human beings, fathers, mothers, children, all seeking refuge, safety and dignity, and yet some leaders treat them as though they were mere statistics to be erased from a spreadsheet. Pope Francis takes a deep breath, letting his words sink into those who advocate such policies. I say this: you may win elections, but you risk losing your humanity. Remember, we are all children of God. To treat any human being as less than that, it will end badly, very badly, like trying to fit a camel through the eye of a needle. Badly. The congregation laughs nervously before breaking into applause, recognizing the gravity of his message. Now allow me to share a personal anecdote. Pope Francis says, leaning back in his chair, some months ago I met with a couple at the Vatican, a husband and wife whose names you might recognize. During our meeting I couldn't help but notice how elegantly she carried herself, exuding grace and poise. Naturally, I felt compelled to compliment her. He pauses, savoring the suspense, but then inspiration struck me. Instead of offering a typical compliment, I decided to go bold. Madam, I said, your beauty is so radiant that even Michelangelo would struggle to capture it in stone. She smiled politely, though I suspect she thought I'd lost my mind. The audience roars with laughter, imagining the scene. Of course, the Pope adds with a wink. Her esteemed spouse seemed less impressed, perhaps because he prefers gold-plated everything, including compliments. More laughter fills the air, punctuated by scattered applause. Clearly, the Pope is having fun, and so is everyone else. As we reflect on these stories, let us remember the core values that bind us together as a global community. Love thy neighbor, not just the ones next door, but also those across borders. Compassion, not just for the wealthy and powerful, but for the poor and vulnerable. Justice, not just for ourselves, but for future generations. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops has frankly not been a good partner in common sense immigration enforcement that the American people voted for, and I hope again as a devout Catholic that they'll do better. Vice President J.D. Vance, who converted to Catholicism in 2019, says Catholic clergy who criticized the Trump administration's immigration policy are concerned about money. He said this on CBS News Face the Nation, and I think that the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops needs to actually look in the mirror a little bit and recognize that when they receive over $100 million to help resettle illegal immigrants, are they worried about humanitarian concerns? Or are they actually worried about their bottom lines? His voice rises now, carrying a sense of urgency. We live in tumultuous times, my friends, times when division often masquerades as strength, and fear passes itself off as wisdom. But let me remind you, God did not send us here to build walls. He sent us here to tear them down, to replace hatred with hope, anger with understanding, and indifference with action. The crowd listens intently, moved by the Pope's passion and conviction, and finally Pope Francis concludes, let me leave you with one last thought. There is an old saying, when you don't want to see, you don't see. Some leaders choose to ignore the suffering around them, convincing themselves that ignorance is bliss, but history will judge them not kindly. I suspect we see as going against some of the basic tenets of our faith. Frankly, are the fundamental right of every human person that need to be respected, no matter their origin, no matter their situation. He pauses, gazing out over the sea of faces before him. So, my dear friends, go forth and spread kindness, not walls. Share love, not fear. Preserve dignity, not disgrace. For in Doing so you honor not only yourselves, but the Creator who made us all equal in His eyes. With that, Pope Francis steps away from the podium, waving goodbye as thunderous applause echoes throughout St. Peter Square as the cameras flash and reporters scramble to capture every detail. One thing becomes crystal clear. Today the world witnessed not just a religious leader but a comedic genius, and perhaps the greatest raiser of our